I want to bring in Latosha Brown with Black Voters Matter, who's on the ground right there. Latosha, if you're with me, I heard your beautiful voice today on AM Joy as you were remembering John Lewis in song. What's going through your mind and your heart as you're watching this right now?
So I have so many emotions. I'm really thinking about, how classic this moment is. I'm really thinking about the legacy of the boy from Troy, of Alabama, who was Alabama's native son. I think of myself even as a native daughter of Alabama, and how much those of us who've lived in this state have fought over the years to secure the right to vote. It's interesting that in this very state, it gave us the voting rights movement. And it gave us the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but it was also this state that gave us the Shelby versus Holder decision, which stripped the voting rights of its teeth and eliminated Section 5 of it, which was the teeth in the Voting Rights Act. And so it's such an interesting moment. It's almost like a dichotomy of sorts, that on one hand, there is this promise and this powerful movement, but here we are 55 years later, and we are still fighting to secure the right to vote. Even just recently, in the last couple of weeks, with the Supreme Court ruling that ruled against having these mailing drop-off ballots for people in the midst of COVID-19. This is also a state that, in the legacy of John Lewis, who was an avid fighter for poor people. This is a state that has refused to expand Medicaid. In the midst of many rural hospitals being closed, in the midst of this being a hot spot right now for the COVID-19 virus. And so in all of that, as I say all of that, I am having the moment of really being able to reflect and celebrate the legacy of John Lewis, but I am also having a somber moment of the realities of this state that has not transformed to the extent that we needed to transform, just like many other places in America. So, in that, what I'm feeling right now is I'm very honored that I got to be able to walk with John Lewis and know him and study his history and be able to do some of the work of his legacy. And I'm also very hopeful in this moment, and even more committed that we've got to fight for democracy, that democracy as it is in the Constitution has not been secured. That when we're thinking about the right to vote, we're 100 days before the next election, one of the most critical elections in this country. And so I'm hoping that we'll all take a moment to be reflective and also recommit ourselves for fighting and standing for humanity, standing for poor people, standing for those that do the work, people who were mentors of mine in this state, like Senator Hank Sanders and Faya Toure, who have stood and literally been creating Jubilee and stood and continue to fight for the voting rights. So I am hoping, as I'm standing outside, as I witness his body go into the rotunda of that state, I'm hoping that the spirit of his work actually saturates the walls. So when the legislators come back, that they actually have a transformative experience, so that this state becomes a state of pride and not a state that has consistently tried to marginalize people.
And as we are watching live images, just explain to our viewers and our listeners right now, we're looking at the steps going into the state capitol in Montgomery. Latosha, this is where you are standing right now as we're talking to you on the phone. Explain the significance of this moment, because we watched as the casket of John Lewis was taking that final trip over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. This was a place where John Lewis said, "I thought I was going to die on this bridge." That was 55 years ago. He was leading 600 demonstrators to right here to the Capitol to fight for voters' rights. Only 2% of African Americans were registered to vote at the time. That was March 7th, 1965. Here we are some 55 years later as he is being honored. Talk about the significance of this, and also as we are 100 days out from this election, how important it is right now to get the vote out.
So that's a wonderful question. I don't know if people who study the movement, they may recognize that what happened is that in Perry County, Alabama, what was the spark that we know from the Selma Montgomery March was actually, there was a man named Jimmy Lee Jackson who was actually murdered by state troopers. When we're talking about police violence, that part of the civil rights movement wasn't just about the vote, but it was actually ignited by an act of violence by the state. The state troopers actually murdered Jimmy Lee Jackson in Perry County, Alabama. And the people were so upset that what they wanted to do is they actually wanted to walk that night. Reverend James Orange used to tell this story to us consistently, and C.T. Vivian. They wanted to walk that night from Perry County to bring Jimmy Lee Jackson's body and put it on the steps, these very steps that we're looking at, on the steps of the Capitol, to let the state know this is one of our brothers that you have killed, that you have murdered for doing, only trying to really fight for the right to vote. And so there were some of the organizers in SNCC and SLC that said, no, let's organize and let's have a march where we actually march as a group. And then some will know that there was one attempted march that had happened earlier, but then there was this. So this march from Selma to Montgomery, the impetus of that was actually an act of police violence when an innocent man who was trying to protect his grandfather was actually killed by the state police. And so in that, what wound up happening is that they committed themselves to the Selma to Montgomery march. We know that on Bloody Sunday, they were beaten back once again by the state troopers and state police in the state of Alabama. And so they came later, and people joined from all over the country, all over the world. And there was a trek, a 50-mile trek from Selma to Montgomery, where they marched every day, 10 miles a day, and people met them. And so it's really surreal to experience that part of the motorcade. We actually were at the end, bringing up the rear of the motorcade that went in. We literally, to be there and to see people lined up in Lowndes County and Wilcox County and Dallas County and Selma, to stand on the side of the roads on that very same route. So his body once again is now in the rotunda of the state of Alabama. But many of the issues that they were fighting then are still the issues that we continue to fight. We are continuing to fight against state section violence against Black people in this country. That is what has led to the uprisings in all 50 states. We are still consistently fighting for the right to vote, particularly in light of voter suppression, when we know, like the Brennan Center had a report that talks about from 2016 to 2018, there was over 17 million voters that have been dropped from the voting rolls. It means that just like I went to vote in Georgia just a couple of weeks ago, that I stood in line for 3 hours, that there were other African-American voters that stood in line for 5-6 hours. When we look at Kentucky, where in Kentucky, in the same place where there's not been any justice for the murderers of Breonna Taylor. But in addition to that, what we also know is that they're in a county, in Jefferson County in Louisville, where the majority of the African-American population lives, for 612,000 voters, there was only one polling site. So we continue to see this fight. It changes in some ways, and some things they don't seem to change at all. But what we are committed to doing, what gives me hope and what I have seen and been so inspired by, is as we were passing by, as we were going down the 50-mile trek from Selma to Montgomery, I was seeing and witnessing people who had tears in their eyes and fists raised and love in their heart. Like that people, when the people rise up, things will change. So that is what gives me hope 100 years out. It's not a matter of what other folks will do. What it matters is what we will do to make sure that democracy becomes real in America.
3 hours in line to vote. Latosha Brown, thank you so much for your time. We are so lucky to get to hear your perspective. You're going to be speaking there tonight at the ceremony. Hopefully we'll also be able to talk with you a little bit later. But for now, we'll be right back.